We all love games that tell stories. And the more game studios hire talented writers and narrative designers, the more we're seeing games with a story that emerges through gameplay, instead of having a plot tacked on through the occasional cutscene. But sometimes, the mechanics we use in games end up telling a different story than the one we intended. They can put a different cast on a situation, or end up completely deforming the narrative and making things, well, a little weird. So today, we're going to talk about how mechanics shape your game's story. Big thanks to World of Warships for sponsoring this episode. Download the game at the link below and command your own fleet for free. New players should use the code PlayLangley2019 for a bonus starter pack. Before we start, a quick shout out to our returning guest writer for this episode, Eddie Webb. He's worked on video games and tabletop RPGs for over a decade. Thanks for helping out, Eddie. Let's start off our discussion with Pokemon. That well-loved franchise of light-hearted games about children wandering through the world trying to be the very best, like no one ever was, casually stealing animals from their natural habitats and training them to fight in brutal contests for personal glory. You know, that sounds a little weirder when you say it out loud. I mean, sure, the games themselves don't actually say any of this. In fact, each of them goes to great lengths to position the Pokemon as being friends with the trainers in the world. And even when Pokemon fight each other, none of them ever die. They just, quote-unquote, faint. But the mechanics here tell a different story. Scratching the family-friendly surface, we find underneath the beating heart of a turn-based JRPG. Concepts like hit points that measure a character's health, attack that decreases those points, and potions that replenish health through unspecified means all stem from the heavy combat-focused nature of those games. And if you look, that fundamentally violent core is still in the Pokemon games as well. And while Pokemon never die, they still do get sick and hurt from fighting. And there's a wide variety of medicines you can use to help them recover from their wounds. The old-school mechanical systems that comprise the underpinnings of the Pokemon games says something about the violent nature of the world, even if the characters in the game say something completely different. In fact, let's go back even further. JRPGs themselves were originally inspired by the granddaddy of tabletop role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons. You might not realize it now with the modern editions of D&D, but the earliest versions went something like this. Character goes to a dangerous place to hunt down monsters and take their treasure. Treasure allows characters to buy more powerful weapons, and experience from killing monsters increases a character's fighting potential. Then, with better equipment and higher levels, characters can hunt down more powerful monsters to get even more treasure and even more experience. And so on, and so on, and so on, until your character either dies or retires. In the early days of D&D, this brutal and violent cycle wasn't a small part of the game. It was the entire point of the experience. This kill, loot, level cycle is what we call the core gameplay loop, or the thing that players do the most often in the game. And of course, back then, you could have a D&D game that doesn't focus on killing monsters and stealing treasure, but those activities were the easiest and most efficient way for your character to grow. And that progression helps you be even better at killing bigger monsters and taking more treasure. That core gameplay loop informs everything you do in D&D, even if you're trying to ignore it. So, if you change the story to be about, say, I don't know, children making friends with cute animals, that kill loot level loop ends up telling a different story. But just because you choose to use a core gameplay loop doesn't mean your game has to be shackled by it. For instance, Eddie is the creator of a tabletop role-playing game called Pugmire, which is about dogs living far in the future trying to reclaim a world abandoned by humanity. He wanted Pugmire to use the well-established mechanics of Dungeons & Dragons as a basis, but more so, the game had to tap into the values of friendship and being a good dog over violence and theft. So the first thing he did to address that core gameplay loop was removing currency and experience points. You go up in level when your dog learns something noteworthy, and you can pick and choose whatever equipment makes sense for your character. With no way to earn experience points or money through killing monsters, the mechanical incentive shifts to simply tell a good story. Now, bluffing enemies or running away from them are viable options for progression, and as a result, players explore those options more, and so a different kind of story can take shape. It's still a heavy fantasy game with plenty of opportunities for action against monstrous foes, but the story that emerges is quite different. Sometimes, though, the core gameplay loop is the entire game. And if that loop syncs with the concept perfectly, it can really tie the whole experience together. Sticking with tabletop RPGs, let's look at Dread. It's a horror game that uses a Jenga tower as its main mechanic. Yes, you heard me correctly, I said a Jenga tower. Do not play that game with Zoe. Whenever a character wants to do something, the player makes a number of pulls from the tower. If the tower stays stable, the action succeeds. But if the tower falls, for any reason, the character dies. What makes Dread so brilliant is that the players start to feel more anxious as the story progresses. Every action could be your last, and the later parts of the game has players trying to convince each other to take even more risks so they can cause the tower to fall instead. That anxiety resonates between character and player, keeping the tension of the gameplay and the tension of the horror genre tightly entwined. So as you're developing the story you want your game to tell, think about what the players are doing most during the course of your game. If your core gameplay loop and your emerging story are lining up, they're going to notice that feeling of harmony. And at the end of the day, that can really help deliver a truly cohesive and enjoyable experience. Okay, Eddie, I've always wanted a good boy doggo. Let's roll one up. Or we could do it another time. Once again, thanks so much to World of Warships for sponsoring this episode. Have you been looking for the perfect blend of action and strategy? If so, your ship has come in. You see what I did there? World of Warships is a free-to-play online game where you take command of a massive naval fleet featuring some of history's most iconic vessels. In fact, all of their ships are based off of 3D scans of the actual ships themselves. And with realistic water and weather effects, along with a consistent influx of new content, I do not think 30 million players worldwide could be wrong. So if you're ready to take command, check out the game using the link below. And new players can register using the code PlayLangley2019 to receive 300 doubloons, 1 million credits, the USS Langley aircraft carrier, 3 days premium time, and more. They had me at doubloons. That's a super fun word to say. Doubloons.